welcome to the second session of today and the fifth overall, mitigating the flow of toxic content. Our speakers will be Isaac Record and Aviv Barnoy. I'm especially happy to chair this session as what it seems to me now, a long time ago, one of my supervisors introduced me to Isaac's work, and Aviv is a colleague, so I have the privilege of working with. Okay, so first talk. Professor Isaac Record from Lyman Briggs College, Michigan State University. He is the director of experiential learning and founding director of the Collaborative Experiential Learning Laboratory. Isaac holds a Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering and in computer engineering, both from University of Maine. With his technical education, he turned to achieve an MA and then a PhD from the Institutes for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. Isaac, my pleasure to hand you the digital floor.
Thanks so much, Ori. It's really great to be here and to be among so many friends who I know well and colleagues whose work I've been reacting to for years. It's really wonderful to be here. I'm going to share my screen. All right, and present. All right, does that look good to folks? All right. First, I want to acknowledge that that this work is co-authored with Boaz Miller, one of our hosts, but he's busy hosting, so I'll be doing the talking today. That's a recent picture of me and an old picture of him, although it looks as though he hasn't aged a day. That's from a road trip somewhere in the Rocky Mountains in the United States back in 2008. Okay, so here's a quick overview of the argument that I'll run through today. I'll go quick over some parts because so much of the rest of the conference has dealt with some of these topics, but I'll sort of slow down in some parts where I think we are making a more unique or novel contribution. So first, epistemically toxic content is problematic. I think everyone at this conference has sort of just acknowledged that without making the argument. And I'll do the same. Epistemically toxic content is widely misunderstood, I think. And I'm going to try to help us create a new understanding of it using a new model that comprises people, posts, and platforms. Oftentimes, at least one of those things is left out or oversimplified in other folks' models. And the focus here is on looking at the social epistemic relationships between these different actors and looking at the difference that technological practicability makes for each of these pieces. So just to foreshadow or telegraph the conclusions on this model, the reasons that epistemically toxic content resists easy solution is because of something called context collapse and the instability of norms surrounding sharing in particular. And also on this model, the usual prescriptions that we hear about won't actually work. They either mistreat or oversimplify their understanding of the people or the platforms in this model. So the solution is to add context, right, to correct further context collapse and to stabilize norms, right? But we have to be really careful how we do that. And I'm going to give some hints as to what I think that might look like. Okay, so first of all, yes, fake news and epistemically toxic content is problematic. I won't say more than that about it. Here's the model. So people create, interpret, and interact with posts using operations that the platform provides and a corresponding ideology of how and why to use the platform. Both of those parts are going to be important. Posts are the atomic units of content. Now, not all social media has to have posts, but the social media formats that we're looking at do. So Facebook, you can think about Facebook posts or Twitter posts or whatever your favorite social media platform is. And in particular, there's a concern, the concern that we're after here is those that are displayed to users in a feed. So there are a number of operations that accompany these posts, like being able to scroll past, reading them, reacting to them with likes or smiley faces, reposting and replying. And then finally, there's the platforms that supply the people with that content in that feed, arranged in a feed, and this accompanying set of operations. So just to highlight a couple of features here, right? The differences in practicability of the various operations that are provisioned by the platform actually matter a lot. It makes a big difference whether it's easy or harder to share versus read the story that's linked. And I'll also argue that people don't agree on media ideology, which is one of the sources of the context collapse and the instability of norms. The posts there's a whole bunch of characteristics of posts when they are arranged in this feed format. So some of them, modularity, algorithmic surfacing, adjacency, right? They're arranged next to each other and they're archivable, so you can go back and look at the past. That tells us a little bit about what users can see in the feed within the platform. So that's one of the things the platform is in charge of. And then the other part is what users can actually do, right? So in social media, the kind of key characteristics are that that posts are modifiable, so you can like reshare them, create GIFs. You can do all sorts of things to manipulate and respond to the existing content, and it's accessible. The tools are right there at your fingertips. It's supposed to make it really easy to interact with these posts in certain ways. You can't just do anything, but you can do lots of things quite easily. So that's the other part that the platform is in charge of, right? So just hold that in your mind, that there are these two broad areas for intervention, right? The decision about what content to show the user and the decision about what operations to supply them with. So epistemically toxic content resists easy solution. That's because, and I'll argue for some of this in the coming slides, context collapse emerges for a variety of reasons, including rapid change in media ideologies and platform provision functionality, right? Facebook is always changing the functions. It, in the last few years, has added different types of responses, including the care button in response to COVID-19. There's also disagreement about media ideologies, unstable norms about interpreting people's behaviors around posts, and I would argue that there's a different balancing of practicability for different potential behaviors that people might have. These are all interconnected, right? And that makes it especially tough because when you change one of these, it has sort of cascading effects through this system. So first, context collapse. So Ilana Gershon defines a media ideology. That's sort of the bigger conceptual part here, is to think about the technology, the practicability in terms of the ideas that we have about what we can do, right? The ideology, and the technical affordances that we can actually carry out, right? What the buttons let us do. So focusing just on that conceptual part first, Gershon has this idea of media ideology as a person's system of beliefs about how a medium communicates and structures communication. So for example, what makes a personal email account different from a work email account, right? Like technically those are identical, but we think about them in a different way. Now, we also think about technically different communication mediums in different ways too, right? A text message, we think of a text message differently than we think of a phone call, partly because it affords different things to us, and partly because we just think of it differently, right? We've just constructed a meaning around those different forms of communication. So Gershon's done some qualitative research here and found that new media ideologies significantly differ between people, and they're not even shared necessarily within people of the same class, generation, race, etc. So no matter what group you're thinking about, you probably disagree with other members of that group about what the media platform is for and how to use it. So one of the reasons for this is, of course, that new media is new and it's constantly changing, which doesn't allow for these media ideologies to stabilize. This is problematic in part because people are often not aware that other people don't share their media ideologies. It's sort of a basic idea of communication that we assume that we're on the same page about what various kinds of statements might mean. But when that's not the case, it creates some problems. Alice Marwick and Dana Boyd take this idea further and they come up with this idea of context collapse to explain what's going on when people post online, thinking that they're posting for one imagined audience, but in fact, a different real audience exists and interprets their views. So online, there are multiple audiences with different information needs, different background assumptions, and different expectations. And a consequence of this is that an audience of an online post might make incorrect inferences or fail to make the correct inferences. So taking stock, context collapse and unstable media ideologies prevent people from correctly interpreting the content of online posts and correctly assessing their validity. And this can be a catalyst for the spread of false beliefs online, right? This probably isn't anything new to anybody in the room, but I wanted to run through that, that idea to just begin to pull apart the differences that, that come from the ideology and the differences that come from the technical possibilities, the technological possibilities. So in addition to this context collapse, there's also disagreement about what norms might govern the sharing of epistemically toxic content, or any content, really. So one place to start is to liken sharing to assertion. It seems at first glance that this might be a good idea. Assertion is just the speech act of telling, and if I'm reposting something, it seems like I'm telling you about that thing. So that seems like a reasonable place to start. Assertion is something like if I ask where you live and you say, I live in Haifa, there are expectations that come along with that. Assertion is governed by an epistemic norm, a social rule that pertains to the validity of the asserted claim. So I would have cause to blame you if you lied about in answer to that question. There are also some other non-epistemic norms associated with assertion, such as politeness and so on. Going a bit further into the norm of assertion, Williamson argues that that knowledge is the norm of assertion because knowledge can be challenged by questions like, how do you know? So this would take the form that if you assert, you should assert that P only if you know that P, right? Using that sort of formal phraseology among philosophers. But there are some problems with using knowledge as the norm of assertion. Sometimes people assert even though they don't know, and they don't seem to be blamed for that. For example, Jennifer Lackey has a great example of a creationist teacher who nevertheless asserts the theory of evolution when she doesn't believe it and hence doesn't know it. But we would expect the teacher in her role as a teacher to assert such things. And in fact, we would blame them for asserting the opposite. For this reason, Lackey argues for a less demanding, reasonable to believe norm. There are other suggestions too, I won't read them out. The point though is that life is complicated and maybe it's naive to expect that exactly the same norm is going to govern all the cases of assertion. Maybe this suggests that the norm of assertion is contextual. Goldberg has argued for a contextual norm of assertion in this form. You should assert that P only if P satisfies your audience's information needs in terms of quality. Given what we've already said about context and context collapse, this kind of fits our model already, so we're going to roll with it. So here's the trouble, though. So first of all, if you think about posting in the more general sense, that's not a speech act by itself. It's a way to perform lots and lots of other possible speech acts, including assertion, but also direction, promising, congratulating, joking, and some others. But if we focus in on just sharing, we might argue that that is a speech act by itself. It's intended to draw other people's attention to something else, something someone else has posted. That's kind of universally true. That's what sharing means. That's its function. But it's often unclear why people want to draw others' attention to a post. And research shows that people don't even sometimes read what they share. So according to Gloria Origi, they share information sometimes to maintain their reputation among their group members, which really has nothing to do with knowledge, right? They may draw on what people similar to them post in order to form their own beliefs and signal to those people that they've also formed those correct beliefs. Sometimes people share a post, and when they're pressured in comments, they claim, innocently or not, that they didn't actually endorse it. We've heard some other takes on endorsement in this conference already. They can do this because the norms and expectations are unclear, and they vary with people and with contexts. So it's unclear whether sharing is governed by an epistemic norm of assertion, and if so, what it is. So here's the contrast, right? Maybe the norm of sharing is just share P if P is share worthy, and maybe you could do some work to unpack that. We won't bother with that at the moment. But maybe if you want there to be a higher standard here, you need something else, right? Maybe you share P if P is share worthy, and something epistemic too. And I'm just going to leave that very vague and let you fill in whatever you like there. The point isn't for us to give you a prescription right now. The point is to say there is no agreement about which of these forms the norm of sharing should take. So sharing ends up being an under-regulated speech act, which leads to faulty belief formation and allows posters to evade responsibility for their harms that their posts cause. Okay, so summing up, both of those pieces, the context collapse and the unstable norms, epistemically toxic content resists easy solution because of context collapse, and that's compounded by some features of the posts themselves, right? They're modular, which compounds this problem. And unstable norms around basic operations also doesn't help here. And this is compounded by the ease of carrying out some of these operations more than others, right? It's way easier to share something, to reshare something, than it is to even click on the thing and read the original content. Let's see, how am I doing on time? So the usual prescriptions don't work, we think. They get wrong some details about this overall system. So I'm classifying the usual responses into two categories. So first, a lot of prescriptions ask people to change their behavior with respect to posts, calling for increased literacy, for example. And that at first seems like a good idea. It appears to respect audience autonomy, right? It's up to you to decide how you interpret things and how you react to them. But in fact, it just blames individuals for a collective problem, and it underestimates the sophisticated motivations and methods that people use to interact with posts. So people often post for the fun of it or for various other reasons. They often post to show group membership, and calls for literacy are at best orthogonal to that concern and sometimes work against it. Sometimes the best way to show that you're a member of a group is to repeat the big lie that forms the basis for that group. This is the case for, say, conspiracy Reddit forums, also maybe anything having to do with QAnon, and lots of other cases online. So just asserting that people have this responsibility to be more literate seems to miss the point here. Likewise, asking platforms to change what posts people see has its own problems. So first of all, it applies old media norms to new media platforms. And I don't know that we actually want to return to the old media regime, right? The promise of new media is that it opens us up to new voices, and research shows that that in fact does happen. And if we were all subject to curation by algorithms, that doesn't seem to be any better. In fact, it may be much worse than curation by an expert editorial staff. In any case, though, we don't actually want that old gatekeeping format back. There are some types of posts that we probably want to exclude, right? Calls to violence and pornography, maybe, and some other things like that. We just want to exclude. But that's not really the cases we're talking about here, right? We're talking about fake news and misinformation, where at least there's an arguable case for asking for wanting to hear about this variety of views. Asking platforms to change what posts people see also vests an authority for curation into the platform that so far they have not demonstrated either the capacity or willingness to do this well. There are lots and lots of bad examples of curation and very few good ones, right? These companies tend to get this wrong, I think, more often than right. And then moreover, just drawing on this old media model has its own problems. Old media has been susceptible to some of these same problems of fake news and epistemically toxic content too. And their major approaches to these, debunking or both sides reporting, ends up letting liars set the agenda, which I don't know that that's going to help us in the long run either. Okay, so the other prescriptions didn't work. Our prescriptions do. Our suggestions are pretty simple: set explicit norms and add context. But the key here is to be mindful of practicability and responsibility. What's that mean? Well, so here's our first solution: set explicit norms. One way to do this, one way to fight fake news is to set explicit norms, which will guide people in what is appropriate to post or share and how to react to other people's posts. So some way of modeling this kind of good behavior would be nice. And platforms have a role to play here. They can potentially help by providing users with new or easier operations that would help the users to enforce norms. So one way to do this is to allow for more community moderation. Upvoting has some promising qualities here as well. But the key is that people can only do what they're allowed to do on these platforms. So the platform has to give them the operations that allow for them to set and enforce norms. The other piece is to add context. So this is an alternative approach to what platforms ought to do. Rather than controlling what posts people see, platforms should instead, or maybe in addition, encourage or require people to add context to their posts, especially when they share or repost something. Perhaps by simply asking, why do you want to share this? Do you agree with it? Do you stand behind it? Currently, this is the opposite of how Facebook sharing works. They had a brief moment when they asked for a bit more than that, at least in the US, in the run-up to the election and the time after that. I think they've now reverted to form, but there's still lots of experimentation in this area. The key, though, is that the platform does have a role to play here in making it easier for people to add context. So not sure how I'm doing on time, but I'll wrap up. Here's a review of the argument. We all, I think, have agreed that epistemically toxic content is problematic, but widely misunderstood. I've introduced you to a new model comprising people, posts, and platforms with a focus on social epistemic concerns and technological practicability. And on that model, that model helps us to explain why epistemically toxic content resists easy solution and why the usual prescriptions don't work so well. And then our solution is just to add context and stabilize norms, but with really careful attention to how we do this, paying attention to the operations that the platform provides. All right, that's it. I'll use the rest of the time for questions.
Thank you very much. So we have many questions, I see, and not a lot of time. So obviously not all the questions will be asked. Giacomo, please.
Yes. So first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really, really interesting. And it's kind of funny because just today I gave a presentation about context collapse. And now it actually, with context collapse, instead of the diffusion of epistemically toxic content, what you have is an easier tendency for people to interact in an uncivil or a violent way with one another. The reason being that basically what happens is that you see content that is generated, right? But it always feels out of context because it is really the platform design that is all oriented into you consuming the audience and applying what you think and your values and leaving out basically the context and the values of other people eventually that may or may not be in your social network. So I was wondering, and I really agree with the idea of, trying to set up contextual norms because it's a bit of a good solution between just give all the blame to the social media companies on the one hand, or give all the responsibility to users, which are in themselves not really feasible solutions. But maybe you could say that a good way of doing this would be to create a sense of community as social media users, like trying to give an acknowledgement of being not simply the user and everything else is kind of objectified and simply part of the feed and other people are just basically what they post, but it's more about trying to push or prompt people to reflect in a way or another how their vision is always limited and trying to give a more give a sense of epistemic community by giving making people feel as part of an ecology. There is some stuff that I don't know if you know about Lisa Nelson. She wrote a really good book about social media and morality and about the application of post-phenomenology with this kind of stuff. I will share the link to the book later. But do you have maybe some examples, that's a big question, or some ideas of something that might work in this sense?
It's a good question. I like the suggestion that that in order to build context, we need to build community. I think a lot of the best examples of well-working communities online do have this. A lot of Reddit communities with strong moderation or at least clear moderation rules do fit into this. The reason that we focus on feeds here is that they're algorithmically produced and context free, right? It's just everybody's posts all over the place. And so it's the hard case. So I'm not sure I do have great ideas on how to create community. I do like your suggestion that there might be something platforms can do to just remind people every once in a while that they are a part of a community. Nextdoor recently introduced a new function where if they think you're going to post something racist, and Nextdoor is a neighborhood-based thing, and so anytime people see people of who appear to be like a different race than them, they're posting on Nextdoor lots of racist things. So Nextdoor now has a feature that tries to capture these and warn the person, hey, you might be coming off as racist. So maybe that sort of solution may help a little bit on some of the edge cases.
Can I add something? I think that, some suggestions are really simple, like, for example, adding a date to a post that would prevent the circulation of irrelevant news. Asking when something happened, when you see some old news resurface as new news, or asking the poster to make explicit her stance toward the post. Why does she agree or disagree or neutral, or is she neutral with respect to the post? And I also want to just mention, because I see that I saw in the chat, we are relying on work done by other people here. So we should mention that in the two conflicting norms of sharing that Isaac discussed, we heavily relied on Sasha's work, which he presented yesterday. Share if interesting, or share if interesting only if true, those two competing norms that he presented. And of course, Regina Rini's work on the norm, or the unstable norms of assertion in social media. We think that she gets some of the story right, but we think that because we think that sharing is a different speech act than testimony, there needs to be a different treatment of this act of sharing. So I just wanted to say that.
Okay,
thank you.
So, Glenn, please. And if you keep it, try to keep short both the answer and the question, we'll squeeze more questions, but only if you see it's possible.
I'll try to be as brief as possible. And so thank you for that talk. That was really fascinating. And I think they're good suggestions, but I did kind of have a worry to what extent they will be successful if they're not strictly enforced. So especially if we just kind of say, well, these platforms should encourage people to add context, or they should kind of encourage, something like community moderation, upvoting, but there's no strict enforcement if people kind of don't comply or don't respond to that, if it's really effective. And I wanted to think particularly about Reddit as an example that you also mentioned yourself, because I think Reddit has these things, right? It has an upvoting function, it has community moderation, and yet subreddits like the Donald could kind of form on this platform. So I feel like we see a lot of the worst in terms of misinformation on a platform that had some of these structures in place already.
Yeah, I think you're right about those different Reddit communities, but I would argue that actually those are the norms in those communities, right? So in the Donald, and I haven't explored that community myself very much, but in that community, and in the precursors to 4chan and places like that, you're meant to say the most outrageous things. That's the community norm. And you get upvoted if you do more outrageous things, and downvoted if you do less outrageous things. That's fine. But when you move over to another community, say, one about physics or something, maybe that's not the behavior you want. And so it's appropriate that different Reddit channels or communities can form different rules, and then they have the tools to enforce them. I'm right there with you that I think some of our prescriptions, like, it's hard to see exactly how to make them workable. Nevertheless, at least we're setting up criteria that I think we can say that if these criteria are met, then we have a chance of succeeding. And if they're not met, then we're not likely to succeed.
I can add that platforms have a lot of control on how they make people follow norms. For example, if I have to put some long text, at least 50 characters long text for every post that I share, I'll have to say something meaningful to contextualize it. So this is just a very simple way to make people explain more why they're sharing, if they cannot post unless they give an explanation. And also, with respect to norms in general, the nice thing about norms, and epistemic norms in particular, if I can quote Helen Longino, is that they grip on the individual. So people follow norms even if they don't agree with them. because once the norm is in place, people don't want, you don't want to be dressed with the only black shirt in a community where everybody wears white, right? People want to conform. They usually don't want to be different. Although they can violate norm, they usually don't do it unless they have a very good reason to do it. So I think that by setting the correct norm, and Isaac is right, not any norm, but the correct norm, we can actually reach a lot of the correct epistemic norms, we can actually solve the problem to a large extent.
Right. Nick, Karen, T, Axel, unfortunately our time's up, but I encourage you, if it's possible, to write the questions in the chat. And let us thank Isaac Record. Isaac, thank you.